Tonight, we drift back to the summer of 1940, to a time when the skies above Britain carried the distant hum of approaching aircraft, and the outcome of a war had yet to be decided. This is the story of the Battle of Britain. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in, find a comfortable position, and allow your mind to slow. There's no need to focus too closely, just let the story unfold at its own gentle pace. In this video, we'll move slowly through those long days and quiet nights, following the rhythms of life on the ground and in the air. From the soft glow of radar screens to the early morning stillness of airfields, this is not a story of noise and chaos, but of patience, endurance, and the passing of time. So, as the world around you grows quiet, and your thoughts begin to wander, let yourself be carried into the past. And we'll begin in the early days of the Battle of Britain. Close your eyes now, and let yourself settle. Feel the weight of the day begin to ease, away from your shoulders, away from your thoughts. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Only here, only this quiet. Tonight, we are going to drift together, back through the years, back to the summer of 1940, to green English fields, to the smell of cut grass and engine oil, to the sound of church bells, and the distant, fading hum of propellers in a pale blue sky. Let your breathing slow. It is early July. The countryside south of London is very still. In the villages of Kent and Sussex, places with gentle, ancient names like Bigden Hill and Hawkinge and Tangmere, the mornings arrive softly. Mist lies low across the fields. Cattle stand at the hedgerows. Swallows dart between the eaves of farmhouses that have stood for 500 years. This part of England is called the Garden of England, and in the summer of 1940, it still looks exactly that way. Orchards heavy with early fruit. Hop gardens with their tall poles and trailing vines. Country lanes winding between meadows full of cornflowers and ox-eye daisies. And yet, scattered among those orchards and meadows, are the aerodromes. Long, flat expanses of grass, trimmed short. Wooden dispersal huts at the edges of the field. Blast pens made of earth and timber, where sleek, quiet aircraft are tucked out of sight. Telephone wires running from a small operations building, a place called the sector station, out to the world beyond. These are the stations of fighter command, and the young men who live here are, for the most part, barely more than boys. Let the image settle, a summer morning on an English aerodrome, the grass still damp with dew, the sun just clearing the tree line to the east. A Hawker Hurricane sits at the edge of the field. Perhaps you have seen photographs of it. A sturdy, confident aeroplane, built lower to the ground than you might expect, with a broad elliptical wing and a wide-set undercarriage that makes it look permanently ready for business. The paintwork is matte green and brown on top, the colors of the land below, and a pale sky blue on its belly, so that from beneath it disappears into the heavens. The engine is a Rolls-Royce Merlin. That name will become famous before this summer is through. When the Merlin runs, it makes a sound like no other engine in the world, a deep, resonant, slightly uneven note, rising and falling with the throttle, like something alive. For now, the Hurricane is quiet. A ground crewman in blue overalls moves slowly around it, touching the surfaces, checking the rivets, the control cables, the oil lines. He has been doing this since before 6 in the morning. He will do it again before noon. He will do it again before dusk. This aeroplane is his responsibility, and he tends it the way a farmer tends a prized animal. The pilot is sleeping. He is in the dispersal hut, a low wooden building not far from the aircraft, furnished with iron-frame beds and battered armchairs and a stove that gives out more smoke than heat in the winter. Right now it is warm enough that the door stands open to the morning air. He is perhaps 21 years old. He might have a name like Peter, or Jeffrey, or John. He went to school not so long ago. He learned to fly at a civilian flying club, or perhaps through the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, which spent the late 1930s training young men across Britain quietly and steadily, against the possibility of exactly this moment. He can fly very well. He is trained in formation flying, in navigation, in the theory of air combat, deflection shooting, the geometry of pursuit curves, the importance of height and sun. He has hundreds of hours in his logbook. He has fired his guns at a towed target sleeve over the sea. But he has never been in a real fight. That is about to change. Let the scene soften a little, the dispersal hut, the open field, the dew on the grass. Take a slow breath in, and slowly out. Somewhere across the Channel, France has fallen. It happened quickly, and it was a shock to almost everyone. On the 10th of May, 1940, Germany launched its great offensive in the west, through the Ardennes forest, where no one expected an armored thrust, bypassing the careful defenses of the Maginot Line. Within weeks, the British Expeditionary Force was cut off, compressed toward the coast, evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk in a desperate operation that lasted 9 days and saved over 300,000 men, though it could not save their guns, their vehicles, their supplies. By the 25th of June, France had signed an armistice. The guns on the continent fell quiet, and Britain was alone. Standing on the white cliffs of Dover, on a clear day, you could see the coast of France barely 22 miles away. The same coast that was now occupied by the forces of Nazi Germany. The Channel is not wide. It has always been England's moat, a narrow strip of grey-green water that, for centuries, kept invaders at bay. But the summer of 1940 brought new questions. Could a moat that wide stop aircraft? Could it stop a determined crossing by a modern army if the skies above were controlled by the enemy? The answer to both questions depended on the men asleep in the dispersal huts. Let the thought settle gently. Let it drift past like a cloud. The man who held fighter command together was Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. He was 57 years old, with a long face, steady grey eyes, and a reputation for cool, methodical thought that had earned him the nickname Stuffy among the officers who found him difficult to warm to. Dowding was not a man for speeches or gestures. He communicated in memos and signals. He thought carefully, made decisions slowly when he could, and then held to them. He had been building the air defense of Britain for 4 years, not just the aeroplanes, but the whole system that surrounded them. The radar stations along the coast, the observer corps posts inland, the plotting rooms deep underground, the telephone networks that could pass information from a radar operator on the cliffs of Kent to a pilot in a cockpit in Kent in under 4 minutes. He called it his integrated air defense system. It was, for its time, one of the most sophisticated pieces of military architecture in the world. And in the summer of 1940, it was about to be tested. Let your eyes feel heavy. Breathe slowly, in and out. The radar stations. They stand along the coast of England like sentinels, tall, skeletal masts, 250 feet high, rising from headlands and clifftops from the Orkneys to the Isle of Wight. There are also shorter receiving towers nearby, squat and cross-shaped. Together, they form a chain. Chain home, the system is called. It works by transmitting radio pulses out to sea and listening for the echoes that return when those pulses strike a metal aircraft. The returning signal appears as a bright flicker on a cathode ray tube, a small green line, dancing on a pale screen, in a darkened room. The operators who watch these screens are, for the most part, young women, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. They sit in quiet, focused concentration, hour after hour, watching the flicker, measuring its bearing and its distance, picking up a telephone handset, and reporting, in calm, steady voices, what they see. Rate approaching. Bearing 115. Strength, large, estimated 6 to plus. From the radar station, the information flows down the telephone lines to the filter room at RAF Bentley Priory, north of London, where it is checked and refined and passed on to the underground operations room, where WAAFs with long plotting rods move colored counters across a huge map table, building up a picture, in near real time, of where every enemy formation is, and where every British squadron is, and what might happen next. It is a quiet operation, patient, almost meditative, and it is about to matter enormously. The morning deepens. The dew begins to lift from the aerodrome grass. Somewhere in the distance, a lark rises, singing. The young pilot in the armchair shifts slightly in his sleep. His logbook sits on the table beside him. His flying helmet hangs from a hook on the door. His parachute is already strapped to his aircraft, waiting. He does not know, exactly, what is coming. None of them do, quite. They know there will be fighting. They know the Germans are on the other side of that narrow sea. They know, most of them, that this summer will be unlike any summer before it. The battle, when it began, did not announce itself with trumpets. It crept in quietly, at first along the edges of things, out at sea, over the grey water of the English Channel, where the convoys moved. The convoys were strings of merchant ships, colliers mostly, carrying coal from the northeast coast of England down to the power stations and factories of London and the south. They moved in slow procession through the Strait of Dover, hugging the English coast, flying the red ensign. Tugboats, coasters, small freighters with rust on their flanks and smoke rising from a single funnel. In peacetime they would have drawn no attention at all. But now the French coast was occupied, and from the clifftops above Calais and Cap Gris-Nez, German artillery observers could watch every ship that passed. And from the newly captured airfields of northern France, the Luftwaffe could reach them with ease. The attacks on the convoys began in early July. Small at first, a handful of Junkers 88 bombers, flying fast and low, dropping their loads and turning for home. Then larger, more organized, escorted by fighters. Fighter Command watched, and responded, and began to learn. There is something worth knowing about how time feels, inside a fight. Pilots who survived the Battle of Britain would often speak, later, about this. An engagement that lasted 3 minutes, a brief, violent exchange of fire, a turn, a pursuit, a moment of decision, might feel, while it was happening, as if it lasted an hour. Every detail vivid, every movement considered, though there was no time to consider. The body moved before the mind had finished thinking. And then it was over, and the sky was empty, and you were alone, circling, trying to find the rest of your formation, your heart hammering, your hands tight on the stick. And below you the sea, the cliffs, the green fields of Kent. Still beautiful, still there. On the ground, life arranged itself around the flying. Meals, letters home, games of cricket on the grass between scrambles, a game that could be abandoned in seconds when the telephone rang and the duty orderly came to the door of the dispersal hut and called out the order. Pilots would drop their bats, pull on their helmets as they ran, and be airborne in 3 or 4 minutes from the moment the telephone rang. 3 or 4 minutes. That number had been worked out very carefully. It was the time it took for the radar signal to be received, filtered, plotted, assessed, passed down the chain, and translated into an order. At its best, the system was extraordinarily fast. Faster than anything the Germans expected. They had radar too, a system they called Freya, and later Wurzburg. But they did not have the integrated network. They did not have the underground operations rooms, the telephone exchanges, the WAAF plotters moving their counters across the map tables with such patient precision. They would come to wonder, as the summer deepened, how it was that the British always seemed to be ready. The July sky is beginning to darken now. In our story, the convoys have passed through. The last of the day's sorties has landed. Ground crews move among the aircraft in the long evening light, refueling, rearming, patching holes where holes need to be patched. A hurricane is taxied slowly back toward its blast pen. The pilot climbs out, drops to the grass, and stands for a moment with his hand on the fuselage, as if steadying himself. He has been in his first real fight today. He is not sure, exactly, what he hit. He fired his guns, all 8 Browning machine guns, firing together, a sound like tearing canvas, and he saw pieces come off something, and then it was over. He is very tired. He walks slowly toward the dispersal hut. Around him, the aerodrome is settling into its evening quiet. Rooks call from the elm trees at the field's edge. The last light is catching the upper surfaces of the parked aircraft, turning the green and brown camouflage to gold. The Germans had a name for their plan. Unternehmen Adlerangriff. Operation Eagle Attack. It was a grand name, befitting grand ambitions. The idea was straightforward, at least on paper. The Luftwaffe would launch a concentrated campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force, its aircraft, its pilots, its airfields, its radar stations, its repair facilities, its fuel depots. Once the RAF was broken, the skies over southern England would belong to Germany. And then, the crossing. The barges that had been assembling in the Channel ports. The infantry divisions waiting on the French coast. Operation Sea Lion. The invasion of Britain. The day chosen to begin this campaign was given its own name too. Adlertag. Eagle Day. It was set for the 13th of August, 1940. Breathe slowly, let the word drift past. Eagle Day. The 12th of August was a day of preparation and of warning. The Germans struck the radar stations first, a logical move, and one that showed a reasonable understanding of how the British defense system worked. A chain of radar stations with a gap in it was like a wall with a door left open. If you could blind the radar, you could send your formations through unseen, and the plotters in their underground rooms would have no warning to give, and the pilots in their dispersal huts would have no time. Attacks went in against the radar stations at Pevensey, at Rye, at Dover, at Dunkirk in Kent, not Dunkirk in France, but a small village of the same name on the North Downs. Low-flying Junkers 88s, coming in fast over the sea, dropping their bombs, pulling away. The masts at several stations were damaged. One station, at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, was put out of action entirely, its transmitting block reduced to rubble. And yet, the gap in the chain was hidden. The filter room at Bentley Priory broadcast a signal from Ventnor's frequency anyway, as if the station was still working. The Germans, monitoring British radar transmissions, heard what they expected to hear and concluded, incorrectly, that the raid had failed. It was a small deception, but it mattered. The 13th of August arrived grey. Low cloud covered the Pas-de-Calais in the early morning, and the operation very nearly unraveled before it began. Goring, looking at the weather reports, postponed the main attack until the afternoon. But the recall order did not reach all units in time. A Dornier bomber group took off as planned, flew toward England without their fighter escort, who had turned back and found themselves alone over the coast. The Hurricanes of 111 Squadron came up to meet them. What followed was, for the German crews, a rude introduction to what the summer would hold. The Dorniers scattered. Some bombed. Some jettisoned their loads and ran. Several were shot down over the coast and the fields of Kent, their crews parachuting into English meadows, blinking in the August light, to be met by Home Guard volunteers with pitchforks and a great deal of indignant authority. It was not the clean, overwhelming opening that had been planned. Let that image settle gently. Parachutes over English meadows, the summer morning. By afternoon the cloud had lifted, and the main assault began in earnest. It was enormous. From the radar stations along the coast, the plotters watched their screens and counted. Formation after formation appearing on the cathode ray tubes, each one a cluster of bright, dancing lines, moving slowly westward. The voices on the telephone lines were steady, professional, but the numbers they were reporting were larger than anything seen before. 4 to plus, 6 to plus, 8 to plus. The counters moved across the map tables in the operations rooms. The controllers picked up their phones and called the sector stations. Squadrons were scrambled. 12 aircraft at a time, sometimes 2 squadrons together, 24 aircraft, climbing hard toward the southeast, toward the coast, toward the light. The sky over Kent and Hampshire and Dorset became, for several hours that afternoon, one of the most contested pieces of air in the history of warfare. It is worth pausing here, in this quiet, to consider the sheer scale of what was happening above that small, green country. On Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe flew over 1,500 individual sorties, hundreds of bombers, hundreds of fighters, 3 separate air fleets, Luftflotte 2 in the northeast, Luftflotte 3 in the southwest, and Luftflotte 5 in Norway, making a separate attack against the north of England that had not been anticipated and that would end badly for the Germans. The attack from Norway, Luftflotte 5, deserves a moment. It was based on a reasonable assumption. Dowding had stripped the north of England of fighters to reinforce the south. Surely the north would be weak. Surely it could be hit with impunity. But the assumption was wrong. Dowding had not stripped the north completely. And the radar stations on the northeast coast saw the Norwegian formations coming from a long way off. The Hurricanes of 13 Group came up in strength. The unescorted German bombers, the 109s, did not have the range to fly from Norway, were met by fighters they had not expected, and were badly mauled. Luftflotte 5 would not seriously threaten the north again. Breathe in, and slowly out. The attacks on Eagle Day struck several aerodromes. Andover, Detling in Kent, Middle Wallop in Hampshire. But here a curious and important thing happened, a mistake that the Luftwaffe would repeat, with serious consequences. Detling, which was bombed heavily that afternoon, its hangars destroyed, its personnel killed, was not a fighter command aerodrome at all. It belonged to Coastal Command. Its destruction was real and costly, but it did not touch the network that Dowding was trying to protect. The Germans, in their intelligence assessments, had not always correctly identified which aerodromes mattered most. They were striking at airfields, yes, but not always the right airfields. Biggin Hill was still operational. Hornchurch was still operational. Kenley, Tangmere, North Weald, the sector stations that formed the spine of the air defense system, were still intact at the end of Eagle Day. Battered, but intact. The day's fighting ended as the light began to go. Aircraft returned to their fields in ones and twos, some with holes in their wings, some trailing smoke, some with hydraulics damaged and undercarriages that would not lock properly, the pilots holding their breath as the wheels touched the grass. Ground crews ran out to meet them. Armorers checked the guns. Fitters moved from aircraft to aircraft with their torches in the dimming light. The tally, on both sides, was counted. The Luftwaffe had lost 4 to 5 aircraft. Fighter Command had lost 13, with several more badly damaged. The numbers were noted at both headquarters with very different feelings. At Karen Hall, Göring's vast country estate outside Berlin, where he had retreated to study the reports, there was frustration and adjustment. The attack had not been as clean as planned. The RAF was still there. More would be needed. At Bentley Priory, Dowding read his reports with his habitual quietness. He marked the pilot losses carefully. He noted the aerodrome attacks that had missed their most important targets. He did not allow himself relief. He had been in this business long enough to know that Eagle Day was a beginning, not an end. Tomorrow, the formations would come again. Soften your thoughts now. Let them lose their edges. The nights in the summer of 1940 were not quiet in the way that peacetime nights had been. But they were not yet the nights of the Blitz, that sustained hammering of the cities that would come in September and October. These August nights, for the most part, brought a strange interlude. The great formations went home with the light. The aerodromes settled. The sound of the day's flying, the Merlins, the radios, the guns, gradually ebbed away into the evening. And ordinary England resumed, briefly, around the edges of the extraordinary. In the village pubs near the fighter stations, pilots who had been in combat that afternoon sat with their pints in the low evening light. They did not always talk about what had happened. Sometimes they played darts. Sometimes they sat with a dog at their feet and looked at nothing much. The landlords and landladies who served them knew better, mostly, than to ask. In the farmhouses and cottages, families gathered around their wireless sets to hear the BBC News. The announcer's voice was measured, careful. The RAF had, once again, engaged enemy formations over the coast. A number of enemy aircraft had been destroyed. Our losses were, and here a smaller number, which the listeners noted with relief and with a kind of grateful, private prayer. The numbers reported on the BBC were not always accurate. The claims made in the heat of battle were often too high. The same aircraft, attacked by 3 different pilots, counted 3 times. Both sides did this. It was not dishonesty exactly, but confusion. The chaos of a turning fight at 300 miles an hour, with 8 aircraft twisting in the same piece of sky, made certainty impossible. But the story they told, that the RAF was fighting and holding, was true. Eagle Day had not broken fighter command. The battle was 10 days old. The main assault was 10 days old. And Dowding still had his system, his radar stations, his WAAF plotters, his young men in the dispersal huts, sleeping lightly, 1A always for the telephone. The sky above England was still, tonight. The stars are coming out now, if you care to look. Very faint, very far away. The same stars that the pilots would look at, lying on the grass outside the dispersal hut in the late evening, before turning in. Someone might be playing a harmonica, very softly, somewhere across the field. The smell of aviation fuel on the night air, and beneath it, the oldest smell of cut grass and late summer flowers. England in August. Warm and dark and full of history. The Germans had learned something from Eagle Day, and from the days that followed. The radar stations were difficult to destroy permanently. The masts, when damaged, could be repaired with surprising speed, sometimes within hours. And the British had shown an unnerving ability to keep transmitting, or to simulate transmitting, even from damaged stations, so that the gaps in the chain were never clearly visible from the German side. So the strategy shifted. If the eyes of the defense could not be blinded, then perhaps its brain could be cut out instead. The brain was the sector stations. Those crucial aerodromes, Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, North Weald, Tangmere, Debden, Middle Wallop, where the underground operations rooms sat, and the telephone exchanges, and the transmitters that allowed controllers to talk to pilots in the air. Destroy a sector station, and you did not merely crater a runway. You silenced a whole section of the system. The squadrons that depended on it would be flying blind, unable to receive vectors, unable to coordinate, reduced to individual aircraft hunting separately in an enormous sky. It was a better plan. And for a period of nearly 2 weeks, from the 24th of August through to the 6th of September, the Luftwaffe pursued it with a relentlessness that came very close to succeeding. Breathe slowly, let the words come to you gently, like water. The 24th of August was the day the battle changed its nature. On that day, large formations crossed the coast and drove deep inland, deeper than before, pressing past the coastal counties, reaching toward the sector stations. Manston Aerodrome, on the tip of the Kent coast, was bombed so heavily that it became temporarily unusable. North Weald in Essex was struck. Hornchurch was attacked. And that night, by accident, it would later emerge, a German navigator misreading his position in the DAC, bombs fell on London, on the civilian streets of the East End, houses and shops and a church. It was not yet the Blitz, but it was a threshold crossed, and it would have consequences that no one, on either side, had entirely foreseen. But that is the next chapter of our story. For now, we stay with the aerodromes. With the long, grinding days of late August, when the attacks came again and again, sometimes 3 or 4 times in a single day, and the men on the ground and in the air began to move and think and speak with the particular slowness of deep exhaustion. There is a quality to the tiredness that the pilots described, in letters and in memoirs written long afterward, that is worth understanding. It was not the ordinary tiredness of a long day's work. It was something that went deeper than that. A tiredness of the nerves as much as the body. The continual alertness, the readiness to scramble, to be from sleep to cockpit in 3 minutes, to go from the peaceful ground to the violent sky and back again, sometimes 3 times in a single day, wore something down that sleep alone could not easily restore. Some pilots flew 6 sorties in one day, 6 takeoffs, 6 climbs, 6 separate moments of encountering the enemy, or hunting for the enemy, or evading the enemy, or watching a friend's aircraft go down. 6 landings, if they were fortunate. Between sorties, they slept in their armchairs in the dispersal hut, or on the grass outside, helmets and parachutes still on, because the next call might come in 20 minutes. The body learned to sleep in almost any position. The body learned to wake in an instant, fully alert, and be running before conscious thought had quite assembled itself. Let your own body soften now, into the support beneath you. Feel how still you are, how held, how far from any urgency. Biggin Hill was attacked 6 times in a fortnight. 6 times the bombers came across the North Downs and dropped their loads onto the aerodrome that had been there since the First War, that sat on its high plateau south of London with its long grass runways and its brick buildings and its underground operations room. The first attacks damaged the runways and the hangars. Craters were filled by working parties, local laborers, airfield staff, anyone who could be given a shovel, working through the night by the light of lanterns, filling the holes with rubble and rolled earth so that the aircraft could take off again by morning. The later attacks struck the buildings. The operations room took a direct hit. The telephones went dead. The controllers moved to an emergency facility, a requisitioned shop in a nearby village, a single room with a table and a telephone exchange and a plotting map tacked to the wall, and carried on from there, their voices as calm as ever over the radio to the pilots circling overhead. The WAAF sergeant who organized much of this improvised continuity, at considerable personal risk during the bombing, was later awarded the military medal. Her name was Helen Turner. She was 23 years old. There were many like her, whose names are less well remembered, whose steadiness in those weeks held the system together when everything around them was coming apart. On the ground, the landscape of the sector stations began to look like the aftermath of something terrible. Craters on the grass, some of them 10 feet deep, ringed with scorched earth. Broken glass from the hangar roofs, catching the light in the long evening sun. Aircraft that had been caught on the ground by the bombing, reduced to tangled metal and melted rubber. The smell of high explosive, which is a sharp, chemical smell quite unlike anything else, that lingers in soil and timber for days. And yet the aerodromes did not close. Runways were repaired. Operations rooms were relocated. Telephone lines were spliced and relayed. Fuel bowsers moved among the aircraft, refueling them by hand when the pumps failed. Armorers worked in the DAC, reloading the gun bays by touch, because they had done it so many times they no longer needed to see. There is something in this that deserves a moment of quiet attention. The battle in the air was real, and it was dramatic, and it produced the images that would endure, the vapor trails over Kent, the Spitfire climbing hard into the blue. But the battle on the ground, in those last days of August, was just as real, just as hard. And it was won by people whose names appeared in no newspaper, who received no telegram of congratulation, who simply kept going because the job required it. Breathe slowly, let the faces come to you, one by one, soften your thoughts, let them go still. Dowding watched the figures every day with the particular attention of a man who knows he is counting toward a limit. Pilot losses, in the fortnight from the 24th of August, were running at over 120 per week. Replacements from the training schools were coming through at less than that. The gap was not yet critical, but it was widening. He did things that cost him later. Politically, he hoarded squadrons in the north, refusing to commit them to the south until absolutely necessary, because he could see the arithmetic and he would not let it run away from him. His subordinates in 11 Group, the men directly responsible for the defense of London and the southeast, sometimes felt he was not giving them enough. The arguments were real and heated, and they left marks that lasted long after the battle was over. But Dowding's logic was sound. You cannot fight a battle of attrition if you run out of the thing you are attriting. He had 1,300 pilots at the start. He needed to have some left at the end. Breathe in, hold it just a moment, and let it go. By the 1st of September, the system was bending. Not broken, but bending. Several sector stations were operating from emergency locations. Some squadrons were down to 8 or 9 serviceable aircraft instead of 12. Some pilots were flying with injuries, cuts from broken cockpit glass, bruised ribs from hard landings, mild burns from cockpit fires that had been beaten out before they spread, because there was no one to replace them and the flight still needed to be flown. The German intelligence officers, compiling their assessments in the Pas-de-Calais, were beginning to form a picture that was almost accurate. Fighter command was weakening. A little more pressure, a little longer, and perhaps they were not wrong about the weakening. They were wrong about the timing, because something was about to change. Something that Göring himself would bring about, by his own decision, in the first days of September. Something that would, without either side quite understanding it at the time, save fighter command. Winston Churchill gave them their name on the 20th of August, 1940. He was speaking in the House of Commons. He had been there before, during the dark months, finding words for things that seemed almost too large and too terrible for words. But on this particular afternoon, he found a sentence that would last. Never in the field of human conflict, he said, was so much owed by so many to so few. The pilots heard about it, of course. The BBC broadcast it. It was in the newspapers the next morning. Reactions in the messes and dispersal huts were mixed. Some moved, some embarrassed, most reaching for the particular English deflection that prefers understatement to sentiment. One pilot, it is said, remarked that Churchill must have been referring to the mess bills. But the name stuck. The few. And it was true, in its way. There were never more than around 3,000 aircrew who flew in fighter command during the battle's recognized period. Many fewer, at any given moment, who were operational. A very small number of people, holding a very large thing. They came from everywhere. This is perhaps the most striking thing, if you look closely at the squadron lists from that summer. Fighter command in 1940 was not composed only of young Englishmen from cathedral towns and grammar schools, though there were plenty of those. It was a remarkably international force, assembled partly by design and partly by the accidents of war. There were Poles, over 140 of them, flying in dedicated Polish squadrons, 302 and 303, and scattered through British squadrons besides. They had come to England via a long and painful road, the fall of Poland in September 1939, then service in France, then the fall of France, then England. Many of them had lost everything. Their country, their homes, in some cases their families. They flew with a ferocity that their British commanding officers found simultaneously inspiring and slightly alarming. The pilots of 303 Squadron, based at Northolt, would become the highest-scoring squadron of the entire battle. There were Czechs, who had made a similar journey. New Zealanders and Australians and Canadians, who had crossed the world to be here. South Africans, Rhodesians, a small number of Americans, who were technically citizens of a neutral country and had to list their occupation as student in the official records to avoid diplomatic complications. Irish pilots, from both sides of the border. A Jamaican, a Palestinian, a Belgian. The sky above Kent in the summer of 1940 was, if you looked at it closely, one of the most diverse places in the world. Let that thought settle warmly. The British pilots came from every kind of background that Britain contained. There were auxiliaries, men from the county flying clubs, the weekend flyers, who had learned to fly for love of it in the years before the war and who brought to the battle a kind of natural, instinctive airmanship that the more formally trained pilots sometimes envied. There were volunteer reservists, the men from the training schemes of the late 30s, clerks and teachers and farmers' sons who had given their weekends to learning to fly a Tiger Moth over the English countryside. There were regulars, career officers, men who had joined the RAF in peacetime and worked their way through the ranks. They were not, on the whole, given to introspection. Or rather, they were, but they kept it private. The culture of the RAF in 1940 did not encourage the open expression of fear or grief or uncertainty. You were expected to be light about things, to use humor as a kind of armor, to refer to being shot down as getting the chop and to being killed as going for a Burton, a phrase whose origins are obscure but whose purpose was clear, to make the unbearable a little more bearable by giving it a casual name. And yet the letters they wrote home, many of which survive in archives and in family collections, tell a different story. Or rather, the same story, in a different register. Breathe in, and slowly out. A pilot writing to his mother from a dispersal hut in Kent might spend 3 paragraphs describing the excellent kippers he had for breakfast, and then add, almost as an afterthought, that it had been rather a busy few days, and that he was quite well, and that she should not worry. The kippers were real. The business was real. The reassurance was real too, in its way. He genuinely did not want her to worry, because worrying at a distance, with nothing to do about it, seemed to him the worst kind of suffering. So he wrote about the kippers. A pilot writing to a friend, to someone who understood, who was in it too, or who had been, might be slightly more candid. Might say that things had been rather bad lately. Might name, carefully, who had gone. Might say, without elaborating, that he found the nights easier than the days, because at night there was nothing to do but sleep, and sleeping was the one thing that still came easily. And then the letter would turn again to something lighter. A joke about the food. A piece of squadron gossip. The dog that had adopted the dispersal hut and who was, apparently, an excellent judge of character. The dogs deserve a mention. Almost every fighter station in 1940 had at least one dog. Unofficial mascots, mostly, strays that had wandered in and been adopted, or animals that pilots had brought with them, or dogs that belonged to the station and simply belonged to everyone. They slept in the dispersal huts. They sat outside in the sun. They ran, barking, when the aircraft started up, and then settled again when the engines faded. There was something about their presence, uncomplicated, warm, indifferent to rank, that the pilots valued in a way that was hard to articulate. A dog in your lap in a battered armchair between scrambles does not ask anything of you, does not need to be reassured, does not know what a sortie is or what it costs. It simply is, warm and present and entirely content. Let your own body settle, the way a dog settles beside a warm fire. There were pilots who were afraid, and flew anyway. This is worth saying clearly, because the mythology of the few has sometimes painted them as a kind of Superman, cool, almost casual in their courage, belonging to a different emotional species from the rest of us. They were not. Fear before a scramble was ordinary and nearly universal. The particular fear of climbing toward a formation of 60 enemy aircraft, of being vastly outnumbered, of the mathematics of it, of the way a turning fight could in a moment become something you did not have the skill or the luck to escape, was entirely rational, and the men who felt it were not being weak. What they did with it is what mattered. They absorbed it, and stowed it somewhere, and did the job. This is not the absence of courage. It is what courage actually is. Some managed better than others. A few, under the accumulated weight of sortie after sortie after sortie, began to struggle in ways that the culture of the time had no good language for. The phrase used, when it was used at all, which was not often, was lacking moral fiber. It was a cruel phrase for something that was, in modern understanding, a predictable human response to prolonged extreme stress. The men who were diagnosed with it were sometimes treated with sympathy, and sometimes not. The records from this period are painful to read. Soften around that thought. Let it pass through gently. Among the few were some whose stories have survived in particular detail, and who stand, in memory, for all the others. There was Douglas Bader, who had lost both legs in a pre-war flying accident and who had argued, campaigned, and essentially badgered his way back into a cockpit. He flew on tin legs, with a technique adapted to his own anatomy, and he was by all accounts both an extraordinary pilot and a somewhat challenging personality, certain of his own tactical judgment, impatient with those who disagreed. His courage was genuine and enormous. His disagreements with his superiors were also genuine and enormous. He was shot down over France in August 1941, after the battle, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, from which he attempted to escape so persistently that the Germans eventually threatened to confiscate his legs. There was Uldir, a New Zealander with 54 Squadron, who was shot down and survived so many times that his squadron mates began to regard him as indestructible. He was not indestructible. He was skilled and lucky, and possessed of the kind of calm in a crisis that is perhaps the most valuable quality a fighter pilot can have. There was Ginger Lacey, a Yorkshireman who had been a civilian flying instructor before the war, and who would end the battle as one of the highest-scoring RAF pilots, with 18 confirmed kills. He was not, by any account, a natural officer. He was a natural pilot, which is a different thing. And there were hundreds, thousands, whose names are less famous, whose scores were smaller, whose stories survive only in squadron records and family memories and the occasional headstone in an English churchyard. They were the few too. Every one of them. It was the night of the 24th of August. A formation of Heinkel bombers, navigating in the dark over blacked-out England, drifted off course. Their target had been the oil storage tanks at Thames Haven, east of London. But the navigation was imprecise. Night navigation over a country with no lights showing was imprecise for everyone, on both sides, and the bombs fell instead on Fore Street and Cripplegate and the streets around Street Giles without Cripplegate, on houses and shops and a church that had stood since the time of Oliver Cromwell. It was, as far as can be determined, a genuine mistake. But Churchill did not know that. And even if he had, it would not have changed what happened next. Breathe slowly, in and out. The RAF's response was immediate. Within 48 hours, Bomber Command sent a force of aircraft to Berlin. It was not a large force, and it was not particularly accurate. Berlin was a long way away, the weather was poor, and Bomber Command in 1940 was not yet the instrument of precision that its commanders hoped it might one day become. The bombs that fell on Berlin caused modest damage and a handful of casualties. But what they caused in Hermann Göring was something far more consequential than physical damage. Göring had told the German people, publicly and with characteristic extravagance, that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Reich's capital. He had staked his personal prestige on it. He had said, famously, that if enemy bombers reached Berlin, you could call him Maya, a joke at his own expense that he presumably felt safe making, because the thing he was joking about was impossible. It was not impossible. And now it had happened. The humiliation was profound. And humiliation, in a man of Göring's temperament, curdled quickly into rage. On the 3rd of September, Göring met with his senior commanders at The Hague. The decision made in that meeting would change the course of the battle. The attacks on the sector stations, the strategy that had been bending fighter command to the edge of breaking, were to be curtailed. From now on, the primary target would be London. The city itself. The docks, the factories, the railways, the infrastructure. And beyond the practical targets, a secondary purpose that Göring articulated with grim clarity: to break the morale of the British people, to make the city uninhabitable, to force the government to the table. It was called, in the language of the time, a terror-bombing campaign. And it began on the 7th of September, 1940, on a warm and golden Saturday afternoon, when the largest formation of aircraft ever assembled over England crossed the coast and turned toward the Thames. Let the image form slowly, and let it stay at a distance. Nearly 400 bombers. Over 600 fighters. A formation so large that, to the observer corps watchers on the ground, men and women standing in fields and on hilltops with binoculars and telephone handsets, it seemed to darken the sky. The sound preceded it by several minutes, a deep, all-encompassing drone, felt as much as heard, that made dogs bark in the villages below and brought people out of their houses to stand in their gardens and look east. The plotters in the operations rooms watched their map tables fill with counters. The controllers, for a moment, had to make quick calculations. This formation was not heading for Biggin Hill, not for Kenley or Hornchurch. It was heading, with terrible directness, up the silver ribbon of the Thames toward the city. There was, in some of the underground operations rooms that afternoon, a brief, bewildered pause. And then the scramble orders went out. The docks were the first to burn. The Surrey commercial docks, on the south bank of the Thames. The West India docks. The miles of timber yards and warehouses and bonded stores that lined the river's edge, full of the accumulated wealth of trade, timber, rubber, paint, pepper, sugar, rum. When the first bombs struck, the fires that started were not ordinary fires. They were enormous, visible from 50 miles away. The firemen who came, and they came from all over London, every available pump, hundreds of them, found themselves facing something that had no precedent in their experience. Individual fires had joined together into firestorms. The heat was intense enough to buckle the metal of their vehicles. Water from their hoses turned to steam before it reached the flames. They fought it anyway. All night, and into the next morning, and for days afterward, they fought. The river shimmered orange. Ash fell on the streets of South London like grey snow. The smell, of burning wood and tar and sugar, carried on the wind as far as the outer suburbs. Let the image soften, breathe slowly. In the streets around the docks, people had gone to their shelters. Anderson shelters in back gardens, corrugated steel structures, half buried in the earth, covered with soil, just large enough to hold a family crouched together in the dark. Public shelters in church crypts and railway arches and the basements of larger buildings. The London Underground stations had not yet been opened as official shelters. That would come later, after considerable official resistance. But in some stations, people came anyway, pushing past the ticket bearers, spreading blankets on the platforms, settling in for the night with a resigned practicality that would, very quickly, become one of the defining images of the Blitz. A city making itself as small as possible. A city going underground. A city that was frightened, and showed it, and kept going anyway. There is a temptation, when speaking of London in the Blitz, to reach too quickly for the mythology. The Blitz spirit. The cheerful endurance. The cup of tea in the rubble. The warden's whistle and the all-clear and the pub opening its doors again at lunchtime. These things were real. The endurance was genuine. The humor was genuine, dark, stubborn, sometimes very funny. The mutual aid that sprang up in bombed streets, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers sharing food and blankets, and the particular solidarity of shared danger. This was real, documented, attested by hundreds of accounts. But so was the fear. So was the grief. So were the houses that simply weren't there anymore. The familiar corner shop reduced to a gap between two standing walls. The school with its roof open to the sky. The families who carried everything they owned in a single suitcase because everything else was gone. Both things were true at once. The courage and the suffering. The endurance and the cost. London in the autumn of 1940 held all of it, without contradiction. Breathe in, and slowly out. And up above the burning city, the battle continued. The shift to London had done something that Goring had not intended. The sector stations, battered Biggin Hill, damaged Kenley, patched together Hornchurch, were given a reprieve. The craters were filled more carefully now, without the next raid arriving before the last one's rubble was cleared. The telephone lines were properly relayed. The operations rooms were restored or properly relocated. Ground crews caught a few more hours of sleep. The pilots, too. It was not a recovery, not yet, and not entirely, but the pace of the assault on the system had changed. The thing that had been bending toward breaking was allowed, for a brief window, to straighten itself. Dowding noted it. He noted it with the same quiet steadiness with which he noted everything, and he did not allow himself to conclude anything certain from it, because certainty was a luxury the battle had not offered him all summer. But he noted it. The raids on London continued through September, and into October, and through the long dark months beyond. The story of the Blitz, the nightly bombing, the shelters, the extraordinary ordinary courage of the city, is its own vast story, and we will touch only its edges here. But for the battle in the air, for the fate of fighter command, the 7th of September was a hinge. The pressure on the aerodromes had eased. The pilots were still exhausted, still stretched, still flying multiple sorties each day into the enormous formations that climbed over the channel. But the system that directed them, the radar, the filter rooms, the operations rooms, the controllers' voices, was no longer being dismantled piece by piece. It was, barely, holding. There is a particular quality to the light over London in early September. The summer is easing out of it, the hard, blue brightness of July and August softening into something more golden, more angled, the shadows longer in the afternoon, a faint coolness arriving in the evenings that reminds you the year is turning. On the evening of the 7th, from the south bank of the Thames, the sky to the east was the color of embers. The fires in the docks were enormous, and they lit the underside of the clouds with a deep, shifting orange-red that one observer compared to a sunset in the wrong direction. Church bells were silent. They had been reserved, since the spring, as the signal for invasion. The streets were quiet with the particular quiet of people indoors, sheltering, waiting. But the Thames kept moving. It always moved, regardless. The tide coming in, the tide going out, the old river indifferent to the centuries' arguments, brown and deep and full of its own long memory. The fires reflected in it like something ancient. The morning arrived clear and cold, the way September mornings sometimes do, with a brightness that belongs more to autumn than to summer, sharper, somehow, more precise. The dew lay heavy on the aerodrome grass. The first light came over the eastern tree line in long, level shafts, catching the propeller blades of the parked aircraft, making them glow briefly like something ceremonial. The pilots were at readiness from first light. They had been here before, many times. The armchair in the dispersal hut, the telephone on its table, the mug of tea going cold. The waiting, which was its own particular kind of effort. Staying loose, not spending yourself on anticipation, not letting the mind run ahead to what might happen and exhaust itself on possibilities. Some played cards. Some read. Some simply sat with their eyes half closed, in a state that was not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness, conserving something, storing it against what the day would ask. The telephone rang at 10:30. Breathe slowly, in and out. The radar stations on the Kent coast had seen the formations building over France from early morning. This was not unusual. The Germans had spent the past weeks assembling their raids deliberately, orbiting their aircraft over the Pas-de-Calais until the whole formation was together before crossing the coast, partly for organization, partly, the British suspected, as a display of strength, to let the radar see how many were coming. If that was the intention, it worked, in a way. The plotters in the filter room watched the returns grow and multiply. Controllers did their mental arithmetic. Squadron commanders were called to their phones. But the British had also learned, over these long summer weeks, how to use the warning time that the radar gave them. The scramble order went out across 11 Group, and then to 12 Group north of London, and the squadrons climbed hard and fast in the clear September air, reaching for height, turning southeast, positioning themselves above and ahead of the incoming formations. Height. Always height. In the air, height was everything. It gave you speed in the dive. It gave you the choice of when to engage. It put the sun at your back if you were careful. The pilots who survived the summer had learned this, some of them the hard way. The German formation that crossed the coast of Kent at mid-morning on the 15th of September was enormous. 2 waves. The first was a mass of Dornier 17 bombers, long, slender aircraft, twin-engined, nicknamed the Flying Pencil for their narrow fuselage. They flew in tight formation, the way bombers do, because formation flying gave them overlapping fields of fire from their defensive guns, made them a harder target. Around and above them, weaving back and forth, were the Messerschmitt 109 escorts. They crossed the coast near Dungeness and turned northwest, and the intercepting squadrons came down on them from the sun. What followed, over the fields and towns of Kent and then over the southern suburbs of London, was an air battle of extraordinary scale and ferocity. Aircraft turning and climbing and diving across 50 miles of sky. The white threads of vapor trails writing their frantic geometry across the blue. The sound, to those watching from the ground, from the gardens and streets below, was a continuous, rolling thunder, rising and fading and rising again, punctuated by the sharper crack of gunfire. People stood in their gardens, and on their rooftops, and in the streets of South London, and watched it. Let the image settle at a gentle distance. In the operations room at Uxbridge, 11 Group's underground headquarters, a long, low room with a balcony where senior officers could observe, and below it the map table with its WAAFs and their plotting rods, and along the wall the board of colored lights showing the readiness state of every squadron. Things were running very tight. Keith Park, the New Zealander commanding 11 Group, was on the balcony. He was a lean, precise man who flew his own Hurricane to visit his squadrons and who understood the battle in its details with a thoroughness that was almost physical. He watched the table. He watched the board. Squadrons that had scrambled were now engaged. Some were refueling. Some were rearming. The lights that showed available strength were moving in the wrong direction. Winston Churchill had come to Uxbridge that morning. He sat beside Park, watching the table, watching the board. He asked, at one point, how many reserves remained. Park said, "There are none." There was a silence. Every available squadron in 11 Group was airborne or recovering. If a new wave came over now, there would be nothing to send up against it. Churchill said nothing. He sat, watching the table, his face very still. Breathe in, hold it a moment, and let it go. The first German wave turned for home, pursued and harried by Hurricanes and Spitfires that followed them back across the coast. Some of the German aircraft were damaged. Some came down in the fields of Kent, trailing smoke. Some made it back to France with wounded aboard. And then, while the British squadrons were landing, refueling, rearming, a process that took at least 20 minutes, often longer, the second wave came. Another enormous formation. More Dorniers, more Heinkels, more 109 escorts. Again the radar stations tracked them. Again the controllers vectored what squadrons they had. Again the sky above London filled with the white threads and the sounds. This time, something different happened. As the German formation pressed north over London, it was met not just by the squadrons of 11 Group, but by the Duxford Wing, a large formation from 12 Group to the north, 5 squadrons flying together, 60 aircraft arriving all at once in a great, sweeping mass that struck the German formation from above and to the flank. The effect on the German crews was severe. They had expected, by now, to be meeting a broken and depleted opponent. They had been told, by their intelligence officers, that Fighter Command was down to its last aircraft, its last pilots. Instead, here were 60 fresh fighters coming down from the north like something that had no intention of being finished. Bombs were jettisoned over the southern suburbs, falling on streets, on gardens, on a bus in Buckingham Palace Road. The formation began to break up. Aircraft turned for home individually, no longer in tight formation, presenting easier targets to the pursuing fighters. The tally at the end of the day was disputed at the time and has been refined by historians since. In the heat of the fighting, with dozens of pilots all engaging the same aircraft, with the confusion of a turning battle at 300 miles an hour, the claims made that evening were far too high. Fighter Command's initial report claimed over 180 German aircraft destroyed. The true figure, established later from German records, was around 60. Still significant. Still a serious loss. Still, when added to the losses of aircrew, the experienced men who could not easily be replaced, a blow that the Luftwaffe felt deeply. Fighter Command lost 29 aircraft. 13 pilots were killed. 13. Each one of them someone's son or brother or husband or friend. Each one carrying within them, until that September Sunday, a whole private world. We hold that in mind, quietly, before moving on. Let the thought be still for a moment. The strategic significance of September the 15th was not immediately obvious to either side. The Germans did not yet understand that this day had settled something. The raids would continue. There were more attacks in the days that followed, more losses on both sides, more craters on more aerodromes, more fires in London streets. But something had changed. The Luftwaffe had thrown its largest effort at Fighter Command on that clear September Sunday, and Fighter Command had met it, and held it, and turned it back. The unbroken appearance of large numbers of British fighters, the Duxford wing arriving like a second force when the Germans expected nothing, had struck something in the German crews that went deeper than the physical losses. Doubt. For the first time, seriously, in quantity, the doubt that the whole enterprise was possible. Over the following days, the German High Command began to reassess. The invasion, Operation Sea Lion, had been contingent on air superiority over the Channel and southern England. Air superiority had not been achieved. The barges in the Channel ports, which Allied photo-reconnaissance had been watching anxiously for weeks, began to disperse. Quietly, without announcement, Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. It would never be revived. The invasion was not coming. Britain would not be occupied. The government would not be removed to Canada, as had been discussed in the darkest weeks of the summer. The streets of London would not see German soldiers, not because it had been easy, not because the cost had been small, but because, through the long and grinding weeks of that summer, through the convoy battles and Eagle Day and the terrible fortnight of attacks on the sector stations, enough had held. The radar stations, the operations rooms, the ground crews working through the night with their shovels and their spanners, the WAAF plotters, steady at their tables, the controllers, calm on their telephones, and the pilots, young, tired, frightened, skilled, lucky, unlucky, who had climbed into their Hurricanes and Spitfires, day after day, and gone up into the enormous sky. The few. Churchill would speak about it again, later. But on the evening of the 15th of September, in the car back from Uxbridge, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, to the aide beside him, that what he had seen that day was the most moving thing he had ever witnessed. He did not elaborate. He sat and looked out of the window at the September countryside going past, the fields, the villages, the ordinary English landscape that the summer had been fought to preserve, and he was quiet. Some things are too large for words, even for a man who had more words than almost anyone. October light in England is a different thing entirely from the hard blue clarity of the summer months. It comes in lower, more oblique, catching surfaces that the summer sun passed over without noticing. The dew on the aerodrome grass in the morning glitters more intensely. The elm trees at the field's edge have begun to turn, a slow, warm movement from green through gold through amber, leaves letting go one or two at a time, spiraling down in the still air to settle on the grass and the wings of the parked aircraft. The mornings are cold now. The pilots pull their oven jackets tighter when they walk out to the dispersal hut at first light. Their breath shows in the air. The ground crew have their hands deep in their pockets between jobs, and their faces are reddened by the wind that comes in off the channel with a different character than it had in summer, less forgiving, tasting faintly of what is coming. Winter is some way off. But you can sense it, at the edges of things, patient and inevitable. Breathe slowly, feel the imagined chill of that October morning, and then let it go, back into the warmth where you are. The Luftwaffe had not given up. It would be wrong to suggest that September the 15th had been recognized, at the time, as a decisive ending. Göring had not declared the battle lost. Hitler had not cancelled his ambitions toward Britain, merely deferred them, a deferral that would become permanent as the war shifted east, toward Russia, toward the vast new campaign that would consume Germany's attention the following year. But in October 1940, that shift was still in the future. The war against Britain was still, officially, in progress. What changed was the method. The daylight raids, the enormous, organized formations that the radar could track from 50 miles out, that the plotters could plot and the controllers could vector against, these became less frequent, less large, more cautious. The losses of the summer had been real and felt. The experienced crews, the men who had been flying since Spain or Poland or France, were fewer now. Their replacements were newer, less seasoned. The calculation of risk had shifted. Instead, the Luftwaffe turned increasingly to two different kinds of attack. At night, the Blitz, which would continue through the winter and spring, hammering the cities with a persistence that caused enormous suffering but could not, in the end, break what it was aimed at breaking. And by day, something new, and in some ways more demanding for the defending pilots than the great summer formations had been. The fighter bomber. The Messerschmitt 109 could carry a single 500-pound bomb slung beneath its fuselage. A modification, not elegant, that reduced its speed and handling somewhat but transformed it from a pure fighter into something that could both attack and defend itself. Small formations of these aircraft, or even individual aircraft, flying very fast and very high, began to make hit-and-run attacks on targets in southern England. Factories, railway junctions, coastal towns, sometimes London itself, a single bomb falling without warning into a street, a market, a school. These raids were very difficult to intercept. A formation of bombers at 15,000 feet, tracked by radar for 20 minutes, gave the defending squadrons time to climb, position, and engage. A single 109 flying at 30,000 feet, diving at over 400 miles an hour, dropping its bomb and turning for home before the radar had properly resolved its return. This was a different problem entirely. By the time the scramble order reached the pilot in the dispersal hut, the bomb had already fallen. The pilots found this deeply frustrating. There was nothing wrong with their skill or their courage. The mathematics simply did not allow for it. Let that frustration dissolve now, the way all things dissolve in the quiet. There was a different quality to the fighting in October. Partly it was the weather. The clear blue skies of summer, those skies that had seemed, at the time, both beautiful and terrible, were giving way to something more variable. Cloud building in the west through the morning. Squalls coming off the Atlantic, rain sweeping across the channel, visibility dropping to a mile or less. Flying in these conditions required a different kind of concentration. Navigation by instruments, by dead reckoning, by the unreliable compass and the altimeter and the sense, developed over hundreds of hours, of where you were in three-dimensional space inside a cloud. Aircraft that had become separated in clouds sometimes emerged into clear air many miles from where they expected to be. Pilots who had been flying hard all summer and whose nerves were worn thinner than they knew made small errors that accumulated into larger ones. The accident rate, in October, was not insignificant. Fatigue and weather between them claimed pilots that the enemy had not. Doubting continued to count. He was removed from command on the 17th of November. It was handled badly. He was not told in advance. He received a letter asking him to call at the Air Ministry, and when he arrived, he was informed that he was to be relieved. The reason given, that it was time for a change, that a fresh perspective was needed, was true in a limited administrative sense, and unjust in every human one. Dowding had won the Battle of Britain. His system, the radar, the operations rooms, the integrated defense, the careful husbanding of pilots through the hardest weeks, had worked. The invasion had not come. Fighter command was still intact, and he was shown the door. He bore it with the same quiet dignity with which he had borne everything else. He cleared his desk at Bentley Priory. He thanked his staff. He drove away. It is one of the more melancholy footnotes to the battle, and it stayed with him for the rest of his life, not bitterly, his biographers suggest, but as a fact he could not quite set down, a small weight he carried in among the larger ones. History has been kinder to him than his contemporaries were. There are statues now, and a memorial window in Westminster Abbey, and his name attached to a public house near Bentley Priory that he would almost certainly have found amusing. Breathe softly. Let the autumn settle around you. The men who had flown through the summer were changing too. Some were rested, posted away from the frontline squadrons to quieter stations, or to training units, where they could pass on what they knew to the next generation of pilots. This passing on of knowledge was not a small thing. The difference between a pilot with 6 months of operational experience and one fresh from training could be measured, brutally, in survival time. The veterans who became instructors carried with them something that could not be written in any manual, the accumulated instinct of the survivor, the precise and physical knowledge of what it felt like to be in a turning fight at 300 miles an hour with your fuel running low and someone on your tail. Some pilots could not rest, could not easily leave. They had been in it since the beginning, and leaving felt, to them, like a kind of abandonment of the thing they had been part of. They stayed on, and flew on into the autumn, and some of them were fine, and some of them, quietly and privately, were not. The culture still had no good word for this. The body could show wounds. The mind could not, at least not ones that were acknowledged. Men who had flown 60, 70, 80 operational sorties, who had been scrambled 3 times a day through August and September, were expected to be well because they were alive, because they had not been shot, because there was nothing visible. We understand it better now. We can say, from here, that what those men carried was real and heavy and deserved more care than the time gave them. The formal end of the Battle of Britain is dated, by historians, to the 31st of October, 1940. It is, in truth, a somewhat arbitrary line. The fighting did not simply stop on that day. The Blitz continued through the winter. Fighter command kept flying. Pilots kept dying. But the specific phase, the sustained Luftwaffe campaign to achieve air superiority over Britain, to pave the way for invasion, that was over. It had failed. The line drawn at the end of October simply acknowledges what had already, through September and into October, become clear. Britain had not been broken. The few had held. On the last day of October, 1940, the light over England was golden, low and clean. The trees were fully turned now, the elms and oaks and beeches of the Kentish countryside blazing in amber and copper and red, the leaves drifting down through the still afternoon air in long, spiraling falls. The fields were quiet. The aerodromes were quiet too, in the way they were quiet when nothing was immediately expected. A watchful quiet, not a finished one, but quieter than anything the summer had offered. A ground crewman, working alone at the far edge of the dispersal area, paused in what he was doing and straightened up and looked at the sky. It was very blue, very clear, very empty. He stood there for a moment, just looking. Then he went back to work. Let that image hold, the empty sky, the autumn light, the man at his work. You are very nearly asleep now, perhaps, or very nearly. Somewhere between listening and dreaming, where the words come in like water and the images are soft-edged and the boundaries between the story and your own interior quiet are beginning to dissolve. This is exactly the right place to be. The autumn is settling around the aerodrome. The leaves are falling. The Merlin engines are quiet. Somewhere across the field, a light is burning in a window, warm and yellow against the October dusk, and inside, someone is making tea, and the ordinariness of it is, after everything, the most beautiful thing in the world. Ordinary life. Continuing. Persisting. Doing what ordinary life does, which is simply to go on. Still here. Just barely, perhaps. That is exactly right. Let the last of the day's weight go now. Whatever small thing you were still holding, a thought, a worry, the faint outline of something unresolved, let it loosen. Open your hand around it and let it drift. We have come a long way together, through this summer. Through the convoys and the radar stations and the scrambles and the burning docks and the September sky full of vapor trails. Through the dispersal huts and the armchairs and the dogs and the gramophone and the letters home. And now we arrive at the end. Not the end of the story, that goes on, as all stories do, past the point where any single telling can follow, but the end of our journey through it. A quiet place to set it down. The men who flew in the Battle of Britain grew old. Most of them. Not all. Nearly 500 RAF aircrew were killed during the battle's official period, and many more in the months and years that followed. But a great number survived, and lived long lives, and became the kinds of old men who are slightly uncomfortable with the attention their younger selves attract. They were modest, on the whole, in the particular way that the English of that generation were modest, not falsely, not performatively, but as a genuine expression of how they understood what they had done. They had done a job. The job had needed doing. They had been the ones available to do it. The mythology that gathered around them, the few, the finest hour, the summer of legend, sat uneasily on the shoulders of men who remembered it, above all, as exhausting. Some of them spoke about it freely, in their later years. Others barely spoke of it at all, not from trauma, necessarily, though that was sometimes part of it, but from a sense that the real thing and the remembered thing were so different that talking only created a further distance from what had actually been. What had actually been was not a legend. It was a collection of ordinary days, each one lived forward into uncertainty, without knowledge of the outcome, without the comfort of knowing that it would be all right in the end. They did not know it would be all right. They simply kept going. That is worth sitting with, quietly, for a moment. Breathe slowly, in and out. The landscape still holds them, in its way. Drive through Kent on a clear day, down through the North Downs, through the villages with their flint churches and their hop gardens and their names that carry the sound of very old England, and you are driving through the landscape of the battle. The same fields, the same tree lines, the same long views south toward the coast, where on a clear day you can see, just faintly, the line where the land ends and the sea begins. Some of the aerodromes are still there, or partly there. Biggin Hill is a civilian airport now, smaller than it was, its famous name still attached to the control tower and the hangars and the long expanse of tarmac where the grass runways used to be. There is a chapel on the site, St. George's RAF Chapel, and inside it, the walls carry the names. Panel after panel of them, in neat columns, the names of those from Biggin Hill squadrons who did not come back. You can stand in that chapel in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon and read those names in the quiet and feel, without difficulty, the weight of what they represent. Other aerodromes have returned entirely to farmland. The grass has grown back over the blast pens and the perimeter tracks. The dispersal huts are long gone. Only a slight flatness in the landscape, a particular regularity in the way the fields are arranged, hints at what was here. A historian with a map can find it. A farmer plowing will occasionally turn up something, a piece of metal, a ceramic insulator from a telephone line, a belt of corroded machine gun ammunition, and set it aside, and know what it is, and go on with the plowing. The land keeps these things. Patiently. Without comment. There are memorials, of course. The Battle of Britain Monument on the Victoria Embankment in London, bronze figures in flying kit, caught in the moment of readiness, looking upward. The inscription that reads, simply and sufficiently, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The RAF Museum at Hendon, where a Hurricane and a Spitfire hang in the Great Hall among the other aircraft of the century, and where on a quiet weekday you can stand beneath them and look up at the underside of the Spitfire's elliptical wing, that extraordinarily beautiful wing, designed as much by intuition as by calculation, and feel something that is not quite grief and not quite pride but lives somewhere in the country between them. The churchyards. This, perhaps, more than anything. In the churchyards of the villages near the old aerodromes, in Kent, in Sussex, in Hampshire, in Essex, there are graves. Some of them simple Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstones, pale Portland stone, identically shaped, carrying a name and a date and a rank, and sometimes a small personal inscription chosen by a family that had to find words for something that had no good words. Some of them older, more individual, mossy at the edges, the lettering worn but still legible. A pilot officer, age 21, beloved son, the Lord is my shepherd. A flight lieutenant, age 24, of this parish, per ardua ad astra, per ardua ad astra, through adversity to the stars. The motto of the Royal Air Force, a phrase that sounds, in Latin, like something ancient and grand, and that sounds, in English, like exactly what it was, a description of what these young men did every day, that summer. Through adversity. To the stars. Let the words rest in you, let them soften. There is something else the battle left behind that is less visible than monuments or graves, but perhaps more durable. It left behind a way of understanding what ordinary people are capable of when the moment requires it. Not supermen, not heroes in the mythological sense, beings of a different order, immune to fear, untouched by doubt, but ordinary human beings, with all their ordinary fragility and ordinariness, who found themselves inside an extraordinary moment and met it with what they had. The WAAF sergeant who kept the operations room running during the bombing of Biggin Hill. The ground crewman filling craters by lantern light. The young pilot who had never been in a real fight, climbing into his Hurricane for the third time in a single exhausting day. The plotter in the underground room, steady at her table, moving her counter calmly across the map. The fireman on the south bank, facing something his training had not prepared him for, and fighting it anyway. They were not extraordinary people. They became extraordinary people. There is a distinction there that matters. It suggests something about what human beings are capable of that is genuinely, quietly hopeful. It suggests that the capacity is there, in most of us, waiting for the moment that calls it forward. You do not need to be a different kind of person to do a hard thing. You only need to be a person in the moment that requires it. Breathe very slowly now. Let the thought be simple and still. The summer of 1940 is very far away. 85 years and more. The world it belonged to is largely gone. The pre-war England of those aerodrome villages, the regimented formality of the RAF mess, the particular social textures of a country that was at once deeply unequal and, in this moment, somehow unified by something it was not yet able to name. The pilots who are still alive are very old now. The youngest of those who flew in the battle would be in their late 90s. They are leaving us, one by one, as people do. The last living link to the summer of 1940 grows shorter every year. And yet the thing they did does not leave. It lives in the landscape, in the chapel walls, in the letters preserved in archive boxes and family albums. It lives in the aircraft, the handful of airworthy Spitfires and Hurricanes that still fly at airshows and memorials, their Merlin engines making that sound, that particular sound, that is like nothing else in the world. People stop when they hear it. They look up. Something in the sound carries the summer with it, even now. It lives, too, in the simple fact of what came after. Of the country and the continent that existed because the battle was won. Of the lives that were possible because the invasion did not come. Of all the ordinary days, all the kippers at breakfast and cricket on the grass and walks through the hop gardens and church bells on a Sunday morning, that continued, uninterrupted, because enough had held. The ordinary days. Which is all any of us are ever really defending. And now, the story is finished. The summer is over. The autumn has turned to winter, and the winter in its time will turn again. The aerodrome is quiet. The sky above it is full of stars, very faint tonight, a thin veil of high cloud softening them, but there, steady. The same stars that were there the night before, and the night before that, and the night before that, all the way back through the long summers and the long winters to a time before any of this, before the aerodromes, before the aircraft, before the century and all its terrible and wonderful inventions. The stars do not know about the battle. They shine regardless. And on the ground below them, in the dispersal hut at the edge of the quiet field, someone is asleep, completely asleep. The dog is asleep at his feet. The gramophone is wound down. The mug of tea has gone cold on the table beside him. His logbook is closed. He is not on readiness. Not tonight. Tonight there is nothing required of him but this, to rest and restore, and be, for these dark hours, simply a young man sleeping in a chair, with the stars outside and the dog at his feet and the whole long night ahead of him, unhurried and undemanding in kind. Let him sleep. Let yourself sleep. The watch is kept. The sky is clear. There is nothing to attend to, nothing to guard against, nothing that the night requires of you. Only this. The breath going slowly in, and slowly out. The body growing heavier. The thoughts growing quieter. The last few words of the story dissolving into the dark the way all words do, eventually. Into silence. Into rest. Into the deep, unhurried, merciful quiet of sleep. Good night.